In episode 15 you might remember that Heritage only make one toe board, which is designed more for the 90's Mini, which means that I've got some alterations that I need to do to make this fit. As I'm not highly skilled in panel beating, I had an idea and fingers crossed it'll work, but I'm guessing that there's much better ways to do this than I did. Using some milliput that I had lying around, I'm going to make a mould of the shape that I need it to be using the opposite side of the panel, which appears to be the same shape that I need. To stop the milliput sticking, I use masking tape in between the panel and the epoxy. Now it's just a case of mixing 2 equal portions until uniform in colour, then pressing it into the panel and waiting overnight for it to set. Then it simply peels off, as does the masking tape. And realising that I'm going to have to do some welding, and not having much experience of actually welding, I took the old toe board out of the bin and decided to clean it a bit and practice on a few pieces of scrap. I also had the idea of cutting a piece off to use for the new toe board that I was altering. The power file worked well, but the orbital sander was a lot better, until it broke. I also thought it was about time that I ditched the tin snips and used the angle grinder and cut myself a few practice pieces off to weld. The pieces needed flattening out, so I thought it'd be good to try and use a hammer and a vise. I'm not used to metalworking as I normally just work with wood, so it was good to try something new even if I did look quite amateurish. But eventually I couldn't resist using the tin snips again. So now it was time to have a go at practicing welding. The extension lead was completely unwound for safety reasons, as it can produce a lot of heat apparently when coiled up. I then used a power file to clean up the edges of the pieces that I'd cut, and I also cut a piece of copper to try as a backing, to see if it was true that the weld doesn't stick to it. It was tricky clamping everything with these cheap clamps, but eventually it was all securely fastened and ready to weld. But this is when amateur hour really kicked in. Not having much experience with welding, I presume that when you press a trigger and the gas comes out and the wire is near the metal, that it'll start welding. I didn't realise that the gas comes out when you initially press the trigger, but then you have to pull the trigger fully to start the wire feeding through and fire up the welder. Unfortunately it took me several hours to suss this out, but fortunately for anyone watching I've edited most of that out, but you can clearly see the mistakes that I made here. The problem was made worse because every now and again it fired up, and I hadn't sussed out that it was a trigger not being fully depressed and thought that it must be a bad earth, or perhaps the strong winds, so it took a while for the penny to drop. But eventually I sussed out what I was doing wrong. However, that's when I realised that I actually can't weld. I put a few blobs of metal on the plates, but it looked terrible. The thing is, when I filed it down with a power file, it actually showed potential. So I cut myself a blank piece and I took it to the toe board to take some measurements and cut it with the trusty tin snips, thinking that I might now have a chance of doing a half decent job. So the challenge now was to try and shape it around the milliput. This was really fiddly, but after a bit of bashing it started to take shape nicely. And when I offered it to the cart it fitted quite well. So now all I had to do was remove the incorrectly shaped piece from the toe board and replace it with the piece that I'd cut out. If I'm honest, this was quite an anxious moment for me, because if this all goes wrong I've pretty much ruined a brand new panel. But I had no choice and I proceeded to cut the piece off. Now normally I look on YouTube to see what others have done, but I couldn't actually find anything loosely related, so it was pretty much a case of fingers crossed. I cleaned the paint off the piece that I'd made, and I cleaned up the toe board and clamped everything together ready to weld. It certainly wasn't the best welding, but it was enough to do the job, and I was starting to feel a bit more confident with the welding now. So it seemed to be just a case of filling in the gaps with more weld. The beauty of this power file is that it cleans up even the ugliest of welds. The difficulty I had now though was getting the rest of it to look right. So I cut off the excess metal away and I used an old socket to put some shape into it. And like before, I welded it up in stages and took the power file to it. The end result certainly looks acceptable, but if I'm honest, it wasn't really my finest work getting it to this stage. But it is a panel that probably won't be seen anyway, although that's not an excuse for bad workmanship. But the good thing is, now that this is done, I can now get on with fitting this to the car, which in itself is going to be a massive challenge. Prior to making the videos on YouTube, I worked as a firefighter for nearly 20 years, serving my community and helping to save lives and promote the fire safety message. Unfortunately, an accumulation of many upsetting scenes became too much for my mind to cope with, and after years of failed therapy I was retired from the service on the grounds of ill health and signed off medically from any employment. To keep myself busy, both body and mind, I developed an interest in woodworking and car mechanics, and with already having a hobby in filming and music, I combined my interests and started making videos here on YouTube, filming, editing and composing my own music for my woodworking and car restoration channels Smugwood and Smugwood Mini. Unfortunately, to produce such videos comes at a price, and with minimal funds after being retired from employment, I've turned to Patreon to see if there is additional support out there which could allow me to continue making the woodworking and car restoration videos. In return for support, there are various levels which are explained in more depth at the Patreon link below, but includes the chance to win one of my YouTube projects made throughout the year, and also inclusion into random prize draws open to patrons only. In addition, I'd like to thank everybody who already subscribes to my channels, or watches, comments, likes and shares them, as it all goes to help support my channels, and for that I'm really appreciative. It's my hope that I can continue making the videos for the foreseeable future. Thanks once again for your continued support.